Everybody knows Blackbeard the pirate. He had 12 wives, one of which he prostituted. He gassed his own crew and shot his lieutenant when playing at cards. He killed innumerous people and ravaged the seven seas, but was he really such a bad fellow as the stories tell us? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome back to the Piratical Podcast. It has been a while, hasn't it? Some of my older viewers might remember this format from a year or so back, when I did a couple of interviews with prominent figures from the pirate history community. Well, I wanted to revive the podcast for quite a while, but haven't really had the time to do so until recently. So here we are. Now, some of my older viewers will be familiar with my interview with Baylus Brooks, a historian mostly noted for his work on Blackbeard. See, Baylus doesn't think that Blackbeard was such a bad guy, and likewise believes that he was a Jamaican gentleman and plantationer named Edward Thatch, far from the ruffian scoundrel we often imagine. However, Mr. Brooks has a bit of a rival in another pirate historian, Kevin Duffus, who doesn't dispute that Blackbeard might have been nicer than we imagine, but that he wasn't Jamaican, but a native of the Carolinas, where he was eventually caught and defeated. In my correspondence with Mr. Duffus, I not only found his arguments to be captivating, but also his career and lifestyle. So I figured, well, that'll make a grand podcast. So here we are. In this interview, we're not only going to learn about the possibly true identity of Blackbeard, but might totally re-envision who he was as a person, as well as the fascinating people and politics surrounding him and his eventual downfall. Without further ado, I bring you Kevin Duffus. Kevin, who are you?
Well, I've done a few things in my lifetime, or had a couple of careers. I consider myself a research historian. I will admit that I don't have a degree in history, yet I've devoted many years to studying, reaching maritime history, and in particular the coast of the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. My interest in Blackbeard in particular, of course, was began by seeing the Disney movie with Peter Ustinov and Dean Jones back in 1968, Blackbeard's Ghost. And it wasn't long after that, my family was living in the Midwest. My father was a career Air Force officer, and we were transferred to Eastern North Carolina, this small university town of Greenville. And when we arrived there, I realized that we were fairly close, or seemed like we were fairly close to the small island where Blackbeard met his fate and was killed in 1718. And so not long after I earned my driver's license, I asked my father if I could borrow the family car, because I was intent on driving all the way out to Ocracoke Island so I could see for myself this place that was depicted in the movie Blackbeard's Ghost, a roughly 100-foot high rocky cliff overlooking the bay where supposedly Blackbeard not only captured and killed many of his victims, but also on which he built a hotel from the timbers of the ships of his victims. Wouldn't allow me to drive that far. He said I didn't have enough experience, so I convinced him to let me ride my bicycle out there. And I had to recruit two friends, unwitting friends, I would say, who didn't know what they were in for. But the three of us pedaled our bikes for 3 days actually, to get to Ocracoke Island. And when we arrived, I drove to the only store on the island at the time, a general store, and there were a couple of elderly gentlemen sitting in rocking chairs on the porch, and I asked them if they could tell me where I could find that 100-foot high rocky cliff on which Blackbeard built his hotel. And they started laughing and looking at each other, and then one of them told me with what is called a hoy-toy brogue. It's a unique sort of pronunciation of words that is specific to this part of the coast of North Carolina. But he said, son, you've come to the wrong place. He said, the highest place on this island is only 8 feet. And it was then I began to get a sense that movies are probably not the best place to get your history from. But ever since, I've been going back to Ocracoke many times. I eventually had a very strong interest in sailing. And over the years, I've had a number of different sailboats. And in fact, for over a decade, I had a sailboat that I kept in the town of Bath, which is where Blackbeard arrived at in the summer of 1718 and received the pardon from the governor of North Carolina at that time. And so I had a sailboat there, and over the years, I made dozens and dozens of trips from Bath to Ocracoke, sailing essentially the same course that Blackbeard did in 1718. Over time, my interest in his history developed. But my first career was in the television business. I started as a studio cameraman when I was 17 years old, and eventually worked my way up to become the executive producer of a major station on the East Coast. And that gave me a number of great opportunities. I was able to travel to England numerous times in conjunction with North Carolina's, what's considered North Carolina's 400th anniversary, which occurred between 1984 and 1987, which celebrated the voyages of Walter Raleigh to what would become someday the coast of North Carolina, which included what we call the Lost Colony. So, but eventually I kind of did everything I thought I could do in the television business, and I set out on my own to produce documentary films, and I produced a series of history films, maritime history films, which included one on how the tallest lighthouse in America, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, was moved a half a mile to push it back away from the eroding shoreline. And I also produced a 3-hour public television documentary on World War II and German U-boats, which is a subject that's generally not known very well. That in 1942, really the Allies almost lost World War II off the east coast of the United States, and the center of all that U-boat activity was within just a couple of miles of the beaches of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So, and then I made a discovery, was researching another subject. It was a Civil War story that involved the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse and the theft of its 6,000-pound Fresnel lens that was hidden by Confederates during the entire war. And I was able to, through research, find that lens, solve the mystery, and that became my first book. So I made that transition from making documentary films to writing books. And since then, I've written 7 books and have another one in the works. And I really love that more than even making documentary films. So that's a little bit about my past.
Yeah, it sounds like a sort of summary is that it sounds like quite the adventure, from searching for the the cliffs of where Blackbeard built his hotel, and sailing the same waters as him and everything.
Yeah, and I failed to mention, in addition to my sailing the North Carolina waters, and I've actually made a couple of times, I've made the trip between Ocracoke and Beaufort Inlet, of course, which is where he wrecked Queen Anne's Revenge. So I've been on the outside of the Outer Banks, which is a very, very dangerous place. It's been called the graveyard of the Atlantic for the supposedly, thousands of shipwrecks that lie in the waters offshore. Many of them, of course, were the result of both World War I and World War II. But I feel like I have been able to see the world at certain times through Blackbeard's eyes. I've seen the landscapes and the seascapes that he's seen. I've sailed the waters that he sailed. And so I feel like I have a pretty intimate knowledge and familiarity with the world he lived in. But I've sat there on the banks of Bath Creek. One of my favorite things to do was to go out on this dock at night and just imagine the sloop adventure sailing into Bath Creek and dropping anchor, and what that must have been like, and how it affected the local population or inhabitants, and the relationship that he had with them. There are significant connections between Blackbeard and the men who he surrounded himself with in his final days, in the actually throughout his 2-year career as a pirate, actually.
I think it should be quite apparent that your main interest lies in Blackbeard. So it's primarily where the bulk of the interview is going to be concerned. So, in the historical field, you are of course mostly known for your research on Blackbeard. And what differs you from other researchers of Blackbeard is your unique thesis regarding his origins. So, what do you think that they were?
Well, I want to begin by answering your question rather emphatically that I do not nor cannot claim with absolute authority or with direct verifiable evidence who Blackbeard was or from whence he came, and neither can anyone else. And I want to repeat that to this day, notwithstanding the assertions made by various historians and writers, one of whom I know you've interviewed, the identity and the origins of the notorious Blackbeard remain one of the most enduring mysteries of colonial American history. As you know, I mean, did he hail from England, Jamaica, or as I believe the Carolinas? And was his surname Teach or Thatch or something else entirely? There are those who believe he was an undistinguished common sailor from Bristol, England, who was suddenly thrust into the command of a pirate ship. There are others who think that he was a Royal Navy sailor that had an aristocratic Anglican slave-owning background as a planter on Jamaica who inexplicably turned Jacobite and pirate. Or, as I believe, he was an ordinary mariner on essentially what began as a salvage mission, but lured into piracy by a mob of looters and who 2 years later became a pawn in what was, in fact, an attempted political coup in proprietary North Carolina. So these are conflicting interpretations, and they've really provoked hostile debate among historians. And frankly, I find it no small matter. I mean, at stake are the credibilities of monolithic institutions and museums, the reputations of researchers and authors, and the financial stakes of publishers. In fact, I believe the question of Blackbeard's origins and identity is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of early American history. But at the same time, Blackbeard's story is also one of the most distorted, malign, mangled, fabricated fables of pirates of the Golden Age. And I've often wondered, how did these crystal clear waters of history become so befouled over 300 years with the pollution of poor scholarship, fictitious narratives, and invented interpretations? And in particular, that's what interests me. That is really what motivated me to research and study this one single man in pirate history. Frankly, I've not spent much time studying or researching any other pirate, except perhaps maybe Stede Bonnet. I've found, along the way that almost every historical subject I've researched and written about, I've discovered numerous and significant errors that have been repeated and perpetuated by historians and writers. And that's certainly the case with the story of Blackbeard. After years of research and analysis of what are the credible sources, primary sources, I've developed a historical interpretation of Blackbeard's history that I believe is far superior to the others. Frankly, it makes the documented facts of Blackbeard's travels, his behaviors, his actions, and associations with other people much more coherent and intelligible than, frankly, the Bristol or Jamaica arguments. And so in doing this, I've actually, made the costly trip to the United Kingdom's National Archives, and I was just so excited to be able to hold and meticulously transcribe the fragile depositions of merchant captains and letters of colonial administrators like Alexander Spotswood of Virginia and Royal Navy captains. And then while there, I also visited Bristol, and I listened as a local Blackbeard expert there showed me the pirate's boyhood home, simply because there's an etching over the door that says 1718, and he thought somehow that made confirmed that was Blackbeard's home. And he also showed me the tunnels supposedly that Blackbeard had. Well, of course, he wasn't called Blackbeard when he was 14 years old or whatever age he was, that he supposedly escaped an abusive stepfather for his life on the high seas. That's the story you'll be told if you go to Bristol. I believe to seek the man who really, the true man who became Blackbeard, requires a real sharp and critical eye for patterns and pretexts and inconsistencies and impracticalities. And not many historians approach it that way. Sometimes I compare myself to an archaeologist who reconstructs an earthenware jar with just a few of the pieces. I've endeavored to assemble the Blackbeard puzzle from scratch, and without the benefit of seeing the completed puzzle's picture on the box cover. I sought the authentic Blackbeard not by looking for him directly, but by looking at those who surrounded him and analyzing their actions, by piecing together random shards of information, parsing the records of his story, and by examining very much in detail the events of his time. I mean, that's my approach to Blackbeard, and frankly, I have gone out on a limb to speculate as to who he really was, and most importantly, and I want to stress this: again, those men who he chose to be his closest confidants, the men that he went into battle with and who trusted, really ultimately are the keys to who I believe Blackbeard was.
So basically, you believe, or your theory is that his origins are ultimately from North Carolina.
I would say the Carolinas. There is a lot of evidence. In fact, I'll skip ahead here and just say, give you kind of a teaser, but I have found evidence that the black slave Caesar, came from South Carolina, came from a community just outside of Charleston, to the north of Charleston, with his owner, a man named Colonel Robert Daniel, who was appointed and served for 2 years as a deputy governor of what was then the Carolinas, before the two colonies were divided into North and South. Yes, I believe there's absolutely irrefutable evidence. It cannot be ignored, even though it's often been ignored by other historians and writers, that Blackbeard's ties to North Carolina and Bath in particular, and through the identities of the men that he sailed with, his ties to that community are much stronger than have ever been discussed or suggested. In fact, if anything, that's been ignored by other historians because it completely would upset their traditional interpretation of the Blackbeard story.
If we sort of start from the beginning of Blackbeard's story, like where does his life, where does it begin? Where's the sort of earliest origin point that you could sort of trace or estimate at?
The first primary source document that identifies the man who was to become Blackbeard, and of course we'll get into the variations of his name, whether it was Thatch, which is the word Thatch or surname Thatch was the way it was spelled, almost some greater number than, let's say, 95% of the time in period documents, identified him as some variation of T-A-C-H or T-H-A-T-C-H. And again, I want to get back to this, but the word was not pronounced Thatch like we pronounce it today. And neither was teach pronounced as teach in 1718. But so the first document where he appears is a deposition filed by a merchant captain of a brigantine that Blackbeard participated in pirating along with Benjamin Hornigold in December of 1716. He does not appear anywhere else prior to that. December of 1716 is a real interesting time. So it wasn't, but just earlier in that year. In fact, the beginning of that year was what I and some other historians believe was really the birth of the golden age of piracy. I mean, the spark that ignited the golden age of piracy, of course, was the wreck of the Spanish treasure fleet on the central coast of Florida. But it wasn't until January that Henry Jennings was sent by the governor of Jamaica to see what sort of treasure might be recovered from the Spanish treasure wrecks. And that's when we begin to, for the first time, really begin to see some of these names that we know so well. So what I've tried to relate is that to really understand Blackbeard's, the man who became Blackbeard, I have to really characterize it that way because he was only Blackbeard for 13 months. He wasn't named Blackbeard or in a document until October of 1717, just 13 months before he was killed. But the man who became Blackbeard, if we are to believe that he came from the Bath area, then it's necessary, and I did this, it was necessary to research what was going on in what was considered to be the capital of North Carolina prior to 1716. It's absolutely impossible for any pirate historian to be able to speak with any authority about Blackbeard's connections to Bath unless they understood or understand sort of the economic and political aspects of the coast of North Carolina. The fact is that in 1711, there was a war fought between European settlers of the coast of North Carolina and the Tuscarora Nation of Native Americans. In fact, the Tuscarora committed what in today's news would have been considered terrorist acts against the population. And it was had a profound effect on the economy of North Carolina for a number of years after that, after 1711. The plantations, the farmers had been unable really to produce much in the way of food crops. And the economy by 1715 was on the verge of collapse. There had been a severe drought. There had been an outbreak of yellow fever. The settlers on the coast of North Carolina, and especially along what is the Pamlico River, which is the main river just outside of the town of Bath. The town of Bath sits on this small creek, well, small in eastern North Carolina standards. I have to be careful when I say to use the word creek because people kind of think of a small stream, but Bath Creek in places is a mile wide. But it's called a creek. And there's a river that it flows into in some place at the mouth of that river. It's like 8 miles wide. But Bath was really in a destitute economic situation, and it was so bad that the Colonial Assembly, the Speaker of the Colonial Assembly, appealed to the Lords Proprietors who owned North Carolina, who were essentially the rulers of North Carolina, eight men or their families owned and ruled North Carolina, not George I or not Queen Anne prior to her death, but these Lords Proprietors who were given the Carolinas by Charles II in the previous century. And unlike royal colonies like Virginia or New York or New England, the Lords Proprietors had no armed force or navy, or they had no way to support their taxpayers, essentially. And yet they demanded their taxes to be paid every year. And so in 1716, the Speaker of the House of the Assembly appealed to the Lords Proprietors, asking if North Carolinians could pay their taxes with paper, what was called paper bills of credit, or basically an IOU. And the Lords Proprietors refused and actually said their preferred method of payment of their taxes was pound sterling. Well, very few people, if any, in North Carolina at the time had any sort of quantities of pound sterling. And at the same time, roughly around that same time, news arrived from the coast of Florida that these 11 Spanish treasure ships had wrecked and disgorged this fabulous treasure of gold, silver, jewels in the shallow waters and beaches. You know, we know that other colonies had hastily dispatched young men to attempt to salvage that treasure, including, you know, even Lieutenant Governor Spotswood of Virginia. And then not too many months after that, this man named Edward Thatch appears in the records committing acts of piracy, already a captain of his own sloop, manned with 70 men and 6 guns. And I find this really interesting because it really flies in the face of the traditional interpretations by a couple of authors whose books came out in 2006, who parroted Captain Charles Johnson's assertion that the man who became Blackbeard had been courageous and bold, but it was never raised to any command until Benjamin Hornigold made him captain of a sloop in consort. Well, I don't know. In December 1716, Blackbeard was already in command of his own sloop and quite a lot of men, well armed. I believe that what began as a salvage mission, with the permission and encouragement of the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, which we can come back to, but that sort of explains why Governor Eden was willing to pardon Blackbeard with a fake pardon when he returned 2 years later. But also it explains how someone like Caesar, this black slave who was in fact a slave, he was actually owned by Tobias Knight, who was Blackbeard's advisor and mentor and close confidant. Caesar was owned by Tobias Knight. So Caesar, I can prove Caesar was in Bath in 1716, yet Caesar sails back to North Carolina 2 years later aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Well, how did that happen? How did a slave from Bath, in the company of Blackbeard the pirate, leave Bath after the early part of 1716 and then return 2 years later with Blackbeard? So that's one of the clues, of course, that's eluded many of these other writers of Blackbeard history. So that's how I think that it got started. I think they probably were. It began as a salvage company. And by the way, the coast of North Carolina prior to this was well known for being a place that was rife with smuggling and what was called wrecking. On the coast of North Carolina, there are many instances where there were houses and churches and built with the timbers of salvaged shipwrecks. I even once interviewed an old lighthouse keeper in his 90s, and I asked him about a schooner, a big four-masted schooner that wrecked right in front of his lighthouse. And he looked at me and smiled and said, "As a matter of fact, you're sitting in her." And I said, "What?" And he said, "You're sitting in her." He said, this house, I built this house out of the timbers of that shipwreck. So this was even to this day, there's a salvage mentality among the people who especially live along what's called the Outer Banks of North Carolina, this very remote chain of islands, sandy beaches and islands. So it's not that unusual. It wouldn't have been that unusual in 1716 for treasure salvers to sail off the coast of North Carolina, head to Florida to recover gold and silver. I've put myself into their place. I've tried to get in the minds of these men, and especially Blackbeard. And they probably, and I think they were all young men. And I would love to talk about this notion that Blackbeard was something like 38 to 40 years old when he was killed, because I can tell you it's absolutely absurd, and I can explain why. But when you think like young men do, you don't want to disappoint your elders. You don't want to sail back to North Carolina and go, "Oh, well, gosh, the Spanish fought us and, wouldn't let us salvage the treasure. So, well, we came back with nothing." I think this is really how the golden age of piracy began. And by the way, right behind my shoulder here is a painting that I commissioned back in 2016.
I was gonna ask about it. I think I've used it in a few videos as well. It's a very nice painting. So I was gonna ask about it. So what can you tell us about it?
It's a different sort of painting. It's not the kind of painting. I actually instructed the artist to make it almost look like a photograph. It's the kind of thing that it's like a photograph you'd see today of like even a sports team, after their victory. And so this painting depicts the day that Blackbeard and the men from Bath and the slaves, and I have to differentiate between the slaves who served with Blackbeard, who were indeed pirates, but they were pirate slaves. None of them were free men. But it depicts the day that they returned to Bath in July around the 1st of July, end of June of 1718, after being gone for 2 years, and the governor is standing next to Blackbeard, symbolically presenting him with a pardon. This painting, by the way, is depicted from the very piece of property that I have stayed at many, many times over 18 years, and even just in the past year owned it, unfortunately, because the owners had passed away, and I briefly benefited from their generosity. But Bath Creek is in the background, and again, most importantly, symbolically, you see Blackbeard in the center of the picture with his arm resting on Caesar's shoulder, representing this close bond between those two men. They had been friends, I believe, since childhood. And there are other figures in there, including Edward Salter, the barrel maker. A quick funny story, I hired or commissioned this watercolor artist who, when he came back with the painting, I went, "Well, gosh, there's not a single ugly man in the photo or in the painting." And then he explained to me, he said, well, he used to be I guess the executive art director of Gentleman's Quarterly magazine that was based in New York City. And so he was accustomed to painting very handsome men. I'm sure there were probably some unattractive men on Blackbeard's crew. So again, back to your question, I believe this is where their salvage mission began, and they probably did not intend when they left Bath in the summer of 1716 to come back 2 years later as pirates, but also so did a couple thousand other men who got caught up in this contagion of looting that we call the Golden Age of piracy.
No, regarding the painting, what always, as I've said, I'm a bit familiar with it. I've seen it before. So what always struck me about it was, of course, and interested me in it is the portrayal, of course, as Blackbeard, as not only looking younger, but he also looks a bit kinder than he's usually portrayed. He's usually portrayed as being quite terrifying.
Well, it's a great point, and it'll lead me into saying that it was Charles Johnson and everyone else, every other historian and writer who simply endorsed what Johnson wrote. And I often think historians ought to be a little more inquisitive than to simply just parrot something that was written to sell books in 1724. But of course, Johnson really depicted Blackbeard as this ruthless guy, and then even really respectable institutions like Smithsonian and National Geographic, which I grew up reading National Geographic. Probably learned more from National Geographic than I learned in my classrooms. But National Geographic even wrote or published the statement that Blackbeard often, or would, if he coveted a ring on someone's finger, and they were reluctant to surrender the ring, he would simply cut their fingers off. Well, nowhere in the records in the British archives or anywhere else do you ever find that. But and I think that's just a very tiny example of how badly damaged writers have the damage that they've caused to history. It's really unfortunate because those types of things influence millions of people and readers, and they simply believe it and assume that if a magazine like National Geographic would publish something like this, that it must be true. And even to this day, there are people who are spinning these really ridiculous stories and episodes of with regard to Blackbeard. So if you go back and you read the depositions, the original handwritten depositions that reside at the British archives, in almost every instance that I could find, Blackbeard always showed a great deal of I wouldn't say kindness, but he treated the captains of vessels that he would detain with very conspicuous hospitality and respect. And then I don't think the National Park Service of the United States has said on one of their websites, described Blackbeard as possessing inhuman strength. I tend to differ. First of all, there are a number of episodes in the Blackbeard story, well documented, where Blackbeard did not seem to have inhuman strength. In fact, there's the episode after he captures Queen Anne's Revenge, but they encounter a British, or they spot a British warship at some distance or whatever, and Blackbeard's crew were inclined to attack the British warship. And in the records, it clearly states, and I think in a deposition, that they called off the attack because the captain was ill. He was not feeling well that day. Well, that's real, that's interesting. But then there are other instances. This is now in September of 1718. Blackbeard gets in a small boat with his 4 personal slaves, just the 5 of them. And I'm sure the boat was able to sail as well as be rowed. And they made the 50-mile trip across Pamlico Sound and up the Pamlico River to arrive at the house of Tobias Knight, the governor's executive secretary of the council and the collector of customs. And Blackbeard goes to inside Tobias Knight's house for 5 hours, and they discuss this situation, which had to have been, what do I do now, because I'm in the possession of this French ship and I've already gotten the pardon. After Blackbeard spent 5 hours meeting with Tobias Knight in his house, almost certainly discussing how they were going to deal with this, the pirating of this French ship, after he had already received his pardon, which the pardon itself in the first place was not valid. And I can explain that. But on their way back to Ocracoke, they were only about a mile down the river, and it's like 5 in the morning, and Blackbeard decides that he needed a drink. It was a long preceding 24 hours, and they had a long way to go to get back to Ocracoke. And they see this small boat anchored near the shoreline, and he goes over and he shouts to the occupants of this small boat, "Hey, have you guys got anything to drink?" And the owner of the boat, who was the owner of a plantation named William Bell, shouts back, "Well, I have a cask of, or a keg of brandy, but I don't really want to share it with you." And Blackbeard, he gets his oarsman to row over, and Blackbeard jumps across to William Bell's boat and then proceeds to get into a fight, essentially a fist fight. Blackbeard actually slaps William Bell with the side of his cutlass. He doesn't stab him. He doesn't slice him. He whacks him with the side of his cutlass, which actually broke the handle off the cutlass. And then William Bell proceeded to start to get the better of Blackbeard. So Blackbeard had to call his 4 black oarsmen over to subdue William Bell, and which they did. And this is well documented. This information appears in the colonial records of North Carolina. Well, how do you reconcile the statement that Blackbeard possessed inhuman strength when he couldn't even beat up this poor plantation owner? And then, of course, as we well know, in the Battle of Ocracoke, when it got down to the hand-to-hand combat, after all the pre-battle maneuvers and gunfire and broadside, and that when it got down to the hand-to-hand combat, there were 12 Royal Navy sailors engaged 10 pirates in hand-to-hand combat that lasted less than 6 minutes. And when it was over with, all 10 pirates were dead, and not a single one of the 12 Royal Navy sailors were dead. Blackbeard's inhuman strength failed him on that day as well.
I have a few of these like branching questions. You talked a bit about it earlier, about thatch and teach and how they were pronounced during this period. So let's start there. Well, what do you think his name was?
Captain Charles Johnson, in the first edition of his book, wrote that the man who would become Blackbeard as Edward Thatch, T-H-A-T-C-H. And then, for whatever reason, and no one knows, he published or printed a second edition a couple months later, and there were substantial changes to the Blackbeard chapter, and as well as the Stede Bonnet chapter. But in the first edition, he not only identified Blackbeard as Edward Thatch, but he also said that Blackbeard served as what was called a foremast man on Stede Bonnet's pirate ship, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, it's right there, that ought to be a clue. From then on, when you read general history of pirates, you have to be extremely cautious with the information that you're seeing, because he makes a significant error right off the bat in the first edition. And then in the second edition, of course, Mist/Johnson changes the name from Thatch, T-H-A-T-C-H, to Teach. Well, I was always really curious about this. And so I started doing a lot of research into the pronunciation of words during this time and in the decades and centuries preceding. And of course, in 1718, England was in the final sort of stages of what was called the Great Vowel Shift, the transition from Middle English to Modern English. In Middle English, there were essentially no vowel sounds. And it was not until Modern English that letters like EA would produce a long vowel sound. And also, as we know, the digraph th, of course, has been suggested, like the River Thames in London, or the name Thomas. That you don't announce it as Thomas or pronounce it as Thomas or Thames. So I consulted with two different authorities on the great vowel shift, and they both confirmed my hypothesis. I said, is it possible that both THATCH and TEACH would have been pronounced similarly as Tech? This one professor in England said to me, he said, you bring up a very interesting point. And he said, the word, in 1718, the word FEATCH was pronounced as fetch, the way we would say, you want your dog to fetch a ball. And because there was no standardized spelling at the time, you could have spelled the word thatch or Tech. I believe it was pronounced Tech. Edward Tech could have been either Teach or Thatch, the way we pronounce it today. But frankly, I believe that name itself was likely an alias.
Your idea that you mentioned now about the name Tech being an alias, that makes sense if there are no records of someone named Tech in the Carolina region. Correct.
We've done a lot of research, and Tech, Thatch, Teach, was not a surname we find now. Now that you mentioned that, though, in Eastern North Carolina, even to this day, there are I can find numerous instances of the surnames of some of the most significant crew members that served alongside Blackbeard, that appear on bridges and on swamps and in other features in other communities surrounding the Bath area that remain to this day. There are almost certainly descendants of the men who served with Blackbeard who are living in Eastern North Carolina today, and maybe far beyond, because people, of course, moved too. There was a surname, and I was not the first person to discover this, but there was a surname appearing in the early records of Bath, beginning around 1705. And it was a man, it was a sea captain who owned a sloop, who was involved in coastal trade between Charleston and New York, and his name was Captain James Beard. And Captain James Beard moved to North Carolina about the same time that Colonel Robert Daniel, who was an aristocrat who lived in the Charleston area and who was the original owner of the slave Caesar. Captain James Beard and Robert Daniel moved to North Carolina about the same time. And Captain James Beard, had been given hundreds of acres of land in multiple locations. He got 600 acres of land on a river south of Bath called the Neuse River, 400 acres of land on Bath Creek, which, of course, it can't be ignored, was immediately adjacent to the plantation that was later owned by Governor Charles Eden. When you consider the fact that Captain James Beard's next door neighbor or near neighbor, Colonel Robert Daniel, who then sold his property to Tobias Knight, who then acquired the slave Caesar. Caesar was a slave living on the plantation next door to the plantation owned by Captain James Beard. I actually believe, I think there's a preponderance of evidence to at least consider the possibility that the man who was Blackbeard was in fact Edward Beard. And I understand why, but other writers and historians wouldn't even consider this. And really the historical community in North Carolina and those people who are associated with the Queen Anne's Revenge Project have almost ridiculed me for even considering that this would be a possibility. Back to Thatch and Teach and how they were pronounced, it's entirely plausible, but that neither of those names were his. There's one point I'd love to make about the Jamaica theory,
okay,
if you'll allow me, because
of course.
I listened and actually some time ago, I watched and listened to that entire interview you did with Mr. Brooks about his theory about Jamaica. And, I have to say that I found it rather conspicuous that not once during that hour and 15 minutes did he ever present irrefutable evidence that the Jamaican man that he found in genealogical records named Teach was in fact the pirate. There's absolutely no direct evidence whatsoever. And and I've read his book, and I've actually even co-presented with him at lectures, and we even participated in what was supposed to be a debate, but what wasn't, in 2018 on the anniversary of the sinking of the Queen Anne's Revenge. During the well-documented 23 months of the pirate Blackbeard's career, not once did he ever land on Jamaica. And I find it's and I've asked this question, I think I've asked it of Mr. Brooks, but so how do you explain the fact that Blackbeard, in capturing the French slaver Concorde and taking aboard 60 of the slaves, almost certainly the healthiest, strongest, fittest of the 475 slaves that had been aboard the French slave ship, he takes those 60 slaves, and if Edward Teach Jr., as Mr. Brooks calls him, was indeed a plantation owner on Jamaica with slaves, why would Blackbeard not have taken the slaves to Jamaica? Why instead did he not only sail past Jamaica, but spent months trying to get to North Carolina? And why, again, why did this man who was Blackbeard, if he had 60 slaves, why didn't he actually go into Charleston and sell them there, where those slaves would have achieved a much higher price than they would have in this backwater town of Bath, North Carolina, which was 50 miles from the sea and very hard to get to, and a place that had little or no hard currency, even in the summer of 1718. I find, those are questions that, have not been answered. And I also, wonder, so if Blackbeard was from Jamaica and was a stranger to North Carolina and had never been to Bath before, how could he sail in there, convince the governor to give him a pardon that endangered the governor's life and even the governance and ownership of the colony of North Carolina? How would a Jamaican do that?
No, and I think those are very good points. So I'm glad that you were able to include them as well. So as I mentioned previously, I've kind of, and you might have noticed that I've had this like little notebook, so I've taken some notes and kind of changed the questions around a bit. I think it's appropriate to start out with the Queen Anne's Revenge. What do you think happened?
I think it was absolutely deliberate. I mentioned that when Blackbeard detained or stopped the sloop Margaret off the coast of Puerto Rico in December of 1717, and that was when he learned, because he had been at sea for quite some time. He wasn't at Nassau. He wasn't among those men who received advance notice that the king was issuing a pardon for pirates. And so this was really the first opportunity that Blackbeard learned that the king intended to issue these pardons if they surrendered at a certain time and ceased committing acts of piracy after January 6th of 1718, and which was only a month after he captured the Margaret. So he had a month to figure out what they were going to do. Okay, so he's got this flagship Queen Anne's Revenge, and I think there were 3 or 2 other vessels maybe sailing in consort with him, including Stede Bonnet, and so they know that the game is coming to an end, or they suspect that it is, and this really this is a piece of the puzzle that fits very neatly into my contention that these guys they not only were from Bath, but they had to get back to Bath somehow. I mean, again, Caesar was aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, Black Caesar, in December of 1717, yet he, of course, is returned to his slave owner, Tobias Knight, about 7 or 8 months later. I believe that After they sailed away, they released the Margaret. They took the men, including Edward Salter, aboard. There began a series of very private discussions about what to do. Now, Henry Bostock, the captain of the Margaret, informed Blackbeard that they were that the terms of the pardon, which the terms, of course, were released before the pardon itself was released. And I know this for a fact that London newspapers even printed the pardon before it really became effective. And so they knew that. So one of the terms was you have to surrender to the nearest colonial official, whether it's a Royal Navy captain or a governor. Well, in December of 1717, the nearest governor, where Blackbeard was, off the coast of Puerto Rico, he could have either come about and sailed east to Antigua or continued on to Jamaica. Jamaica was probably the nearest colonial governor. Now, according to Mr. Brooks, of course, the man who was Blackbeard was a resident, a very prominent citizen in Jamaica, and supposedly knew the governor and rode around in carriages and was, among the elite of the island. Well, Blackbeard sailed right by Jamaica, continued onward, and ended up in the Bay of Honduras, where we know he captured and burned the ship Protestant Caesar of Boston. And this was well after the January 6th deadline of that, where they were required to cease committing acts of piracy. Well, I believe, and of course this is just conjecture, but it's common sense, that they had to get back to, I believe they had to get back to North Carolina, and to do that, they had to keep everybody aboard, keep all the pirates, and not just aboard, but fed and maybe even liquored up. And so you can imagine 400 men on these pirate vessels consumed an enormous amount of provisions on a daily and weekly basis. They probably burned through all of their provisions probably in a week or so. So they had to continue to commit acts of piracy. And when you look at the depositions of these captains that were captured and pirated, not just by Blackbeard, but other pirates as well, most of what they stole was food and livestock, and of course navigational instruments and charts and sailing instructions and so forth. But most of it was food and liquor. I'm sure that Blackbeard and his inner circle of officers, which included William Howard, who was Blackbeard's quartermaster, and who, by the way, was the son of a plantation owner who lived at Bath. I've proven that. His father was Philip Howard. And I'm sure they had these discussions of like, well, how, what do we got to do to get back to Bath? Well, we're going to have to keep everybody, and once we get to North Carolina, once we get to what was then called Topsail Inlet, but is now Beaufort Inlet, we'll scuttle the ship. They didn't come up with that plan at the last minute. That had to have been, it was really quite a brilliant strategy that they had. And I'm sure it was very closely held among the inner circle of confidants of Blackbeard. I don't think there's any question at all that it was the shipwreck was intentional, and it primarily because an eyewitness to that event, David Harriet, testified under oath in the Charleston pirate trials that occurred later that year that it was in fact done on purpose. Now we jump ahead, over almost 300 years, and in a Smithsonian documentary, one of the archaeologists associated with the Queen Anne's Revenge recovery project states in an interview that, a couple of the cannon were still loaded. He immediately jumped to the conclusion that, well, Blackbeard must have intended to have to, had they gone into Beaufort Inlet and anchored inside the barrier islands there, he must have intended to have to fight his way out if the Royal Navy was out there waiting for him. Well, that's quite a stretch. I mean, that's you weigh that piece of evidence with an eyewitness statement made in 1718 under oath by a man who thought maybe if I tell the truth and I'm honest about this, they won't hang me. I would certainly favor the fact that the wreck was intentional. And of course, when you analyze very closely what happened next, Blackbeard, he tricked Stede Bonnet to sail up to Bath to see if the governor's present and if the governor's willing to give them a pardon. I believe Blackbeard, of course, if he and his men, his inner circle, were indeed from the Bath area, they would have known that it would have taken Stede Bonnet about a week to go up there and come back, a round trip. Bonnet used probably the inland waters of the Sound, of what's called Core Sound, rather than sailing in the ocean. And that gave Blackbeard and his men, his chosen men, which turned out to be 40 white men, the time to salvage from the Queen Anne's Revenge what they needed for the remainder of their journey. The ship was not underwater. I mean, the ship simply broke its back and was on a shoal, and most of the ship probably sat out there for months, if not years, after the wreck. In fact, I don't doubt that some of the local inhabitants of what was to become the town of Beaufort probably used some of the timbers of the ship to frame and floor their houses. So when Stede Bonnet comes back, Blackbeard's gone, and he's not only gone, he's taken 40 white men, but also 60 slaves. They weren't all the same 60 slaves that he had with him when he captured the Concord, but because he traded slaves prior to arriving in North Carolina. But Blackbeard departs, and he sails in this sloop that he renamed Adventure. It was the tender that they used that they captured off of Havana on their working their way north in the spring of 1718. So Blackbeard gets away with the most valuable part of his treasure. Those 60 slaves, today's dollars, in terms of their labor value, were worth as much as $8 million. I've done this currency conversion from pounds sterling in 1718, and that's in terms of their labor value. It was quite a treasure, if you will. The other conspicuous thing about these slaves is that I've researched, as I said, I've researched deeds and property transfers in courthouses in eastern North Carolina, and I found evidence that upon Blackbeard's arrival at Bath in late June, early July 1718, suddenly entire plantations were being sold solely for the price of slaves. So there was a plantation sold in July of 1718, again, almost immediately after Blackbeard arrives with these 60 slaves. Plantation was sold for simply for the price of 2 slaves. And then about 6 weeks later, Governor Eden's former plantation, okay, it's 400 acres, includes his mansion, a very large house, and barns and livestock and other outbuildings and summer kitchens and a dock or a pier, all of it, 400 acres, with all of that on it, was sold to 2 men whose names were Stephen Elsey and James Robbins for the price of 3 slaves. That was the only consideration that was transacted between the seller and the buyer, 3 slaves. And of course, I have their names as well. So, but the curious thing, I've been able to document the names and the fates of about 20 of those 60 slaves, but the other 40 slaves simply disappeared in history. Did they escape? Well, no, I doubt that. They simply, I believe, were assimilated into the plantation society and the families of the members of Blackbeard's crew. And so there was no bill of sale or deed or property transaction. It's the only explanation as to what happened to the slaves whose names don't appear in the records. So that's the more in-depth story of the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge and what transpired.
Knowing these risks about giving this invalid pardon, why was it given to Blackbeard?
Again, this is going to be conjecture on my part, but I really believe that Eden was actually an investor in what was supposed to be, to begin with, a salvage crew setting out from Bath, going to the coast of Florida. And by the way, I believe Tobias Knight's his investment, his in this salvage company was in fact the slave Caesar. So, there's no question at all that Caesar was owned by Tobias Knight in 1716. I believe Governor Eden felt responsible for these guys when they came back. You know, he was very likely the one who sent them out without any written evidence. I still believe it's reasonable and plausible to believe that Governor Eden felt responsible for Blackbeard and these men, and therefore was willing to issue these pardons, hoping that no one would be the wiser. It was a very bad miscalculation. In fact, after Blackbeard was killed and everything began to fall apart, Governor Eden was told by his predecessor, an acting governor named Thomas Pollock, that in a letter, which the letter I've handled the actual original letter, it's in the North Carolina archives. Eden was warned to be very, very, very careful about what was happening, what the intent was by Lieutenant Governor Spotswood, but also the Speaker of the House of the Assembly. And we'll get into that when we talk about the politics. Governor Eden knew this was a very, very dangerous situation. Every single piece of paper, every single document that would have been generated during Blackbeard's interaction with the governor and the government of North Carolina during his last 5 months have all vanished. They disappeared. We got to talk about the politics a little bit. Just as in today, that politics were extremely contentious, and there was a lot of vitriol between the two political parties who were involved in North Carolina government. Governor Eden was the leader of what was called the proprietary colony. His bosses were the Lords Proprietors, and he answered to them, and he had to do pretty much what they told him to do. But every proprietary colony also had essentially a House of Representatives or a House of Commons. They wrote laws, but they couldn't necessarily enact those laws without the permission of the Lords Proprietors. But at the time, the Speaker of the House of Commons, a man named Edward Moseley, who was a very prominent lawyer and a very wealthy and large landowner who grew tobacco and had many slaves, he was the leader of what was called the People's Party. And the People's Party opposed the proprietary party. And one of the biggest reasons why there was this conflict between the two parties is that when the North Carolina pioneers or settlers were attacked by the Tuscarora Indians, they appealed to the Lords Proprietors for help. They said, we need armed forces, we need a Navy, we need Marines, we've got to fight back. And the Lords Proprietors said, well, I mean, they didn't say this, I'm just making the statement that, we're essentially real estate developers, we don't have a militia. So that really antagonized a lot of people living in North Carolina, and also South Carolina as well, because South Carolina had the same problem. The residents of Charleston were attacked by a confederation of the Yamasee Nation in 1715, and that really, they got no support whatsoever from the Lords Proprietors. So both in North and South Carolina, sort of the seeds of rebellion were planted about the same time that we've got this pirate situation. Well, Edward Moseley, and it's almost, I don't have the documentation to prove it, but it's almost certain that Edward Moseley traveled up to Williamsburg and consulted with Lieutenant Governor Spotswood and said, he said, there are a lot of people in North Carolina that would like the colony to become a royal colony and not a proprietary colony. And we have reason to believe that our proprietary governor is colluding with pirates and this man named Thatch. And so they came up with this plan to try to apprehend Blackbeard in the hopes that they might, I believe the whole purpose of the operation to send Lieutenant Maynard to Ocracoke was primarily to recover any sort of written evidence that would incriminate Governor Eden which would eventually lead to the revocation of the charter of North Carolina from the Lords Proprietors and to turn it into a royal colony. Spotswood may have even had designs on maybe sort of assuming control of North Carolina as well. So there's been this this notion that Blackbeard made Ocracoke his base of operations, and that even Spotswood wrote in a letter that Blackbeard was fortifying the Ocracoke, the inlet of Ocracoke, turning it into another Nassau. It was going to be, this pirate base, and that Blackbeard, and amazingly, even academic historians who are otherwise respected in their fields have written that Blackbeard pirated vessels. He used Ocracoke to attack in pirate vessels sailing off the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Well, the fact is that during his time here, he didn't pirate a single vessel off of the coast of North Carolina, not a single one. And the whole notion of fortifying Ocracoke Inlet, and you would have to go there to see what I'm talking about. It would have been virtually impossible. Now, also, keep in mind that when Blackbeard fought his final battle, he had 15 men. And Lieutenant Governor Spotswood wants us to believe that Blackbeard and 15 men were going to fortify the inlet at Ocracoke to take control over the trade going in and out of really the only serviceable inlet on the coast of North Carolina at that time. I don't, that absolutely is not possible. And in fact, in the Civil War, the Confederates attempted to also fortify Ocracoke Inlet, and all of their efforts were absolutely useless. And that was with hundreds, if not 1,000, Confederate soldiers or troops and slaves attempting to build a fort there. So Spotswood comes up with this story, that Blackbeard's pirating ships off the coast, and that he's also been robbing. Spotswood said that he received numerous complaints of traders and plantations who were operating in the inland waters of North Carolina. Well, my research revealed that there was only one complaint, and that came from William Bell, who Blackbeard broke his cutlass by slapping him with it in the middle of the night of September 14th, 1718. That was the only complaint. In fact, I found a document that was produced a couple of years later asking for reimbursement for William Bell and his son, who took 2 horses from Virginia to ride back to North Carolina. They were the only ones who came up and testified against Blackbeard and his depredations on the population of North Carolina. So it's a completely different story than you'll read in anyone else's book. So they come up with this idea to send Maynard down to Ocracoke to try to capture or kill Blackbeard, but primarily to recover evidence. And after the battle, when everything sort of settles down and they tend to the wounded, Maynard goes into Blackbeard's cabin and goes through all of his possessions, and the only piece of written evidence that he can find is a letter from Tobias Knight that Tobias Knight wrote to Blackbeard on the Monday before the battle. And the battle took place on a Saturday, November 22nd, 1718. It was a Saturday. And on Monday, Tobias Knight wrote this letter and sent it out to Ocracoke. Lo and behold, 2 of the men that were captured after the battle were James Robbins, who was Tobias Knight's next door neighbor and who bought Governor Eden's 400-acre plantation along with his partner with 3 slaves, but also Caesar. Caesar's been returned to Tobias Knight, but Caesar goes out and is out at the Battle of Ocracoke, but does not fight. He does not engage the king's men, which is why you can find Caesar living in Bath a year later, even though Charles Johnson and Colin Woodard and Angus Constam all say that Caesar and 13 of Blackbeard's pirates were executed in Williamsburg, which is absolutely not the fact. I found a number of those men, including Edward Salter, who supposedly was executed in Williamsburg, living, quite a long and bountiful life after their so-called hangings. The whole story about Maynard, stringing up Blackbeard's severed head on the bowsprit and sailing to Bath or sailing to Virginia with it hanging on the bowsprit is absolutely absurd and impractical because I mean I've been out on those waters, and if a big wave comes up and washes the head off the bowsprit, you've lost the evidence of your that you're hoping to get paid a bounty for. Plus 6 weeks after the head had been severed from its body, it probably would have been pretty disgusting. All of this happens in December and in Bath, and it's quite a terrible time. I mean, I'm sure Blackbeard was the man who was Blackbeard was well liked. And meanwhile, up in what was going to become the town of Edenton, Speaker of the House Edward Moseley, leader of the People's Party, goes to the house that's occupied by a naval officer, and that house contains it's essentially the archives of the colony of North Carolina. It has all of the official papers and documents and the governor's seal, and just it's essentially an archive. Edward Moseley and a man named Maurice Moore, his best friend, and a couple of other men go in and they physically throw out the occupant of the house out on the dirty, dusty road or whatever, and then they proceed to nail themselves inside this house. They nail the doors shut, and then and this is the day after Christmas, December 26th, 1718, and they stay in that house for 24 hours, and then they pry the nails loose and come out, and they're empty-handed, of course. So why do you suppose they did that? Well, it was because they were searching for any sort of incriminating evidence that would be able to serve their purposes, which is to essentially overthrow the Lords Proprietors. It was nothing less than a coup d'etat, an attempt at a coup d'etat. Very similar, really, to the Watergate break-in in American politics and history. Moseley and his men come out. They're actually arrested by a magistrate. Moseley's punished. But there are no documents, no records, nothing to prove that Governor Eden had anything to do with Blackbeard the pirate. Well, that's really suspicious, and I've proposed that all of those papers were probably smoldering ashes in Governor Eden's fireplace by that time. Edward Moseley was frustrated, and Lieutenant Governor Spotswood was frustrated, and then they all start trying to scramble and sort of cover their tracks. Even Spotswood was censured by a grand jury some months after this. And then Spotswood began sending a flurry of letters back to England to not just the Lords Proprietors, but to the King's Secretary of State, trying to explain his actions, why he did this. And that's when he came up with the idea that Blackbeard was fortifying Ocracoke Island, and he had to do this to save the economy of the King's royal colony of Virginia. So that's sort of the political aspects of the death of Blackbeard that, again, you're not going to find in anyone else's book. I find it really conspicuous that, for example, in Mr. Brooks's book, he completely ignores the identities or the fates of Blackbeard's crew members. How can you ignore the fact that at least 7 or 8 of the 13 men who were supposedly hanged in Williamsburg, including Caesar, are back in Bath a few months later and then continuing to live long lives? I don't know if it's the same Caesar, but so I've been able to trace Caesar through time, along with a man who I believe was his brother, because he had the name Pompey, and I believe their original owner, Colonel Robert Daniel, had sort of a fondness for Roman history, naming these two slaves Caesar and Pompey. But I actually found Caesar, along with the Pompey, like 50 years later, working as coopers for a different family. Again, I can't say for certain that they were the same men. And by the way, I try to be very honest about my interpretation and research. And so when I say, if I can't prove that Blackbeard was Edward Beard, son of James Beard, I admit that. But I don't find that type of honesty among some other historians.
Blackbeard, he basically got caught in the middle of this sort of political conspiracy and these intrigues.
Exactly. I actually have described him as a pawn
Mm,
on the chessboard of colonial politics.
right.
And again, this is all a lot of what I told you, including the burglary of the house that contained all the records
Mm,
by Governor Eaton's political opponent, is all documented in the colonial records of North Carolina, and those are actually available online. It doesn't, it shouldn't take a genius to piece all of this together. It just takes a lot of time and effort. And so I guess for some writers, it's just a lot easier to read general history of pirates and then kind of rehash it in your own words. But I don't believe that's what happened, and I don't believe the man who was Blackbeard came from Bristol or Jamaica.
Oh, you described what happened to Blackbeard and the situation surrounding it and what he wasn't doing at Ocracoke. But what was he doing at Ocracoke?
The first pardon from George I did not achieve the results that his advisors of the Privy Council had hoped it would achieve. Not enough pirates had surrendered, and of course, it's fairly well known and documented that England was about to declare war on Spain, the war that would become known as the War of the Quadruple Alliance, and so the whole purpose of the pardons was to return these former privateers who became pirates back to a legally sanctioned status, accepted status, so that they could help the Royal Navy wage war against Spain. But that was the whole point of these pardons. Well, the first pardon, again, had lacked success. And of course, a lot of pirates, like Blackbeard, when the pardon was sent out, and when the terms described that pirates who wished to surrender and receive the pardon had to suspend committing acts of piracy by January 6th. Some of the pirates that were out operating had not heard about it in time, and therefore committed acts of piracy after the deadline. So the Privy Council advised the king to issue a second pardon with more general terms. So the first pardon said, you'll be forgiven for all acts of piracy committed before January 6, 1718, if you surrender by September 6th of that year of 1718. The second pardon said, you will be forgiven for all acts of piracy up until the moment that you learn of the existence of this pardon. In other words, you could rob someone to your left, and then the guy on the right says, oh, by the way, I've got this pardon for you. And then you would be forgiven for that robbery that you just committed a few minutes earlier. And that was the biggest difference. And so I believe, and I know, that there was constant communication between London and the colonies and the capitals of the different colonies. And I mean, there were ships going back and forth. And so every time news broke in London that the king is considering a revision of his first pardon, that information went aboard a ship and made its way across the Atlantic and eventually reached the ears of the colonial governors. And I'm sure Tobias Knight, by November 17th, again Monday of the week that Blackbeard was killed, was well aware that there was another pardon on its way. And if you read that letter, which is available not just in my book but also in the colonial records of North Carolina, he clearly states that I have something I need you to say. I need you to come back to Bath. If you haven't left Ocracoke yet, I need you to come back to Bath because there's something I need to tell you that I don't want to put into writing. He doesn't want to put it into writing because he doesn't want to be seen as, again, aiding and abetting a pirate. But he certainly wanted to talk to him in person. And unfortunately for Blackbeard, he didn't make his way back to Bath as quickly as he should have. He certainly would have been protected there. He might not have been killed. Of course, we wouldn't even be talking about him now at this moment if he hadn't fought that great battle and lost his life in such a spectacular way, and having his head cut off. I mean, that really adds to the story. But I believe Blackbeard was actually lingering at Ocracoke. I mean, this was very late in terms of weather, that at a latitude that far north. In fact, I researched weather records for my book and learned that the Delaware River outside of Philadelphia was already frozen over that year. It was a very, very cold winter. And so to be hanging out on the coast of North Carolina in late November, which, by the way, November 22nd on their calendar in 1718 actually correlates to December 3rd on our calendar. So they were on the Julian calendar in 1718, and we're on the Gregorian calendar now. So there was an 11-day difference. So in terms of weather, they were actually there in early December, which is even, I've been there on Ocracoke in early December, and boy, the weather can be horrendous. In fact, it was, because it delayed Lieutenant Maynard's return to Virginia for 6 weeks. The weather was so bad. So I think that's what they were doing. They were hoping that the king's second pardon, which would instantly absolve them from all acts of piracy upon its arrival, that was what they were hoping to be able to benefit from. And unfortunately, that pardon arrived on the James River in Virginia around, we don't have the exact date, it was around mid-December, somewhere between the 15th and 20th of December, the night before Blackbeard's former quartermaster, William Howard, was scheduled to be executed in Hampton, Virginia. It was a very timely arrival for him, because it saved his life, and of course the lives of his many, many descendants. I actually am very good friends with a family on Ocracoke Island who claim to be descendants of that William Howard. And boy, they wouldn't be alive today if that pardon hadn't arrived. But unfortunately for Blackbeard, he was killed on November 22nd, and that pardon arrived in the colonies about 3 weeks later. So he came very close to being saved by it.
Do you think that he, if he had received the pardon, if he would have retired or returned to privateering?
Well, that's a great question, and I believe he would have returned to privateering. He was not a farmer. He wasn't a planter. Even if the man who I believe was his father owned a 400-acre plantation, which, by the way, that plantation, the taxes on that. So Captain James Beard died in Charleston in 1711, but the taxes were paid dutifully every year on that plantation until 1718. And all of a sudden, after 1718, in 1719, whoever was paying the taxes no longer paid them, and eventually that land was returned to the government and then resold. But I believe, people forget, and so I've benefited, of course, from many years of sailing and the love of sailing and being on the water, and I especially love being on the high seas, out in the ocean, even in storms. The ocean is such a beautiful place, and you cannot forget that pirates were first and foremost mariners, and they were sailors. And I'm sure that just because they were pirates, they didn't appreciate a day when the sails were filled and the ship was just slicing through the waves and making good speed, and dolphin were, leaping alongside, and I can relate to them on those terms. But it was said, and right at the moment I can't remember the source, and it may have been Captain Charles Johnson, but supposedly it was written that Blackbeard's intention was to sail to St. Thomas to receive a commission from the Dutch governor there to serve as a privateer. And if that was true, it's really curious. So if Blackbeard was this plantation owner from Jamaica, and he's at Ocracoke with 15 men from Bath, and why wasn't his intention to sail to Jamaica and get a commission, to return there to see his family first and foremost? Supposedly he had a daughter there, which I don't believe, and a wife. And of course, the Royal Navy suggested that Blackbeard married while he was in Bath. I think that was based on hearsay, so I can't say that for a fact. But if he had married at Bath during his brief time there, and by the way, he was there very little. You know, again, many books like Robert Lee, who wrote the 1974 book Blackbeard: A Reappraisal of His Life and Times, writes about how Blackbeard had a house at this place called Plum Point, and he hosted parties, and everybody wanted to get an invitation to one of Blackbeard's parties. And this is where supposedly he married this young girl, whether she's 14 or 16, and was probably maybe his 14th wife or whatever. Charles Johnson is the one who suggested that. I did a day-by-day analysis of Blackbeard's calendar between his arrival around the end of June and his death on November 22nd. And he only visited Bath 5 times, and for the most, he was there only over a period of 5 times, a couple of weeks. There was no time for any of these things that supposedly he's been attributed to having done. Yes, he may have. He was a mariner, so had he been received a pardon, or had he never been attacked by the Royal Navy and killed, he would have returned to some type of life on the water, whether it was as a privateer or maybe a merchant sailor. Who knows?
As a sort of like a final tidbit on Blackbeard, and this is also kind of a personal question. So, do you find yourself sympathizing with Blackbeard?
I do, actually. I almost feel like somehow I've been chosen to sort of be his publicist, or someone to sort of rescue his reputation. I think the evidence is pretty clear that he was not a bad guy. He certainly he was a criminal, and but a lot of people, based on our standards today, were criminals in the early 18th century. I mean, even governors and colonial officials, of course, were known to participate in smuggling and wrecking and other illegal acts. So it was a very tough time. It was a hard time to survive. People, I can relate to Blackbeard again on the basis of human nature. Human nature hasn't changed in thousands of years of recorded history. We all like the same things. We like the security of our homes. We enjoy the love of our friends and family. We enjoy having food and money, and being able to live peacefully. And that has been the case again throughout recorded history. So I can relate to them. I can understand why these young men from this impoverished community of Bath, who've just endured this horrific war with their neighboring Indian communities, are trying to figure out, how they're going to survive, how they're going to put food on the table, how are they going to take care of their families. And so, if I were among them and living at that time, I certainly would have probably done the same things they did.
No, so regarding the rest of Blackbeard's crew, you talked a bit about Black Caesar, or just Caesar, but you also talked a bit about Salter, and you also mentioned having at one point had his skeleton in your car. So what is the story of this Cooper, this barrel maker Salter, and what is sort of your relation to him?
So I'm gonna have to take you back to when I was 17 years old, 16 or 17 years old, and my family had just not long before arrived in Eastern North Carolina, and I used to spend a lot of time at the local library, the county library, and one of the first books I found was an early history of the county that was published around 1911, I believe, and in it described this story that the pirate Blackbeard had a sister whose name was Susanna, who lived along the banks of the river called the Tar River that passed Greenville and went on down to the town of what is now Washington, and then became the much larger Pamlico River. But supposedly Blackbeard's sister Susanna lived there, and that according to this author in 1911, Blackbeard would occasionally visit her and get some rest and relaxation in between his piratical cruises. And in 1911, according to the author, the gravestone of Blackbeard's sister Susanna was still visible. And he gave a rough geographic reference. It took a lot of effort on my part. It was a couple of years later, but I decided I had to find the grave of Blackbeard's sister. In fact, the author described that the grave had over the years been disturbed or dug up, or holes around it were dug by people hunting for Blackbeard's treasure. So I thought, wow, I'm a young guy, and thought that would really be cool to find this grave. And so it took a great deal of effort. It was in a very thick woods alongside the river. I eventually found the grave. I found the headstone, the sandstone headstone of this woman whose name was Susanna White, but supposedly Blackbeard's sister. And when I read the inscription on the headstone, I became very disappointed, because I realized that she had been born 37 years after he was killed at Ocracoke. And I realized immediately, well, for whatever reason, this historian who wrote the history of the county was misinformed that this woman could possibly have been Blackbeard's sister, but it was the same name, Susanna White. But for decades after that, I was really haunted by the identity of that woman. And why was this legend? How did this legend begin that somehow she was connected or related to Blackbeard? Then let's jump ahead to 2005, 6, 7. I'm researching my book, The Last Days of Blackbeard the Pirate, and I discovered that in 1986, the state archaeologist of North Carolina, during an archaeological survey, encountered, and then exhumed from an unmarked grave the skeleton of a man. And the skeleton at the time was identified by the state archaeologist as a man named Edward Salter. I was researching this because this was actually on the land that was previously owned by Governor Charles Eden, and then later sold to two men who I believe were members of Blackbeard's crew, James Robbins and Stephen Elsey. Well, the name Edward Salter, when I saw that, boy, that really rang a bell for me, because I remember seeing Edward Salter's name on the list of pirates who were executed in Virginia, according to Captain Charles Johnson, and everybody else who, again, has perpetuated and copied Charles Johnson's text. So I began to do some more research and discovered, of course, then I realized that it was very possible that this Edward Salter, whose bones were dug up by the state archaeologists, were in fact the same Edward Salter who was a barrel maker or cooper on the Queen Anne's Revenge. In fact, the bones were of a man who had been a cooper. So I I contacted the state archaeologist office and met with them, and they were very fascinated with my idea and my theory. And I said, well, where are the bones now? And they went, well, we think they're at this university called Wake Forest University. So then I contacted the archaeology department there, and they go, no, we sent the bones back to the state. They have them. So then I contacted the state again. They go, well, they're around here somewhere. We don't know exactly where. And I said, well, you realize the skeleton could represent the only surviving human remains of someone who was a pirate during the golden age of piracy. There have been some scattered bones, I think, recovered from the wreck of the Witta on Cape Cod, but they can't be connected to anybody. I doubt even through DNA. But this is definitely a bona fide remains of someone who had been a pirate. Well, then the state suddenly became very difficult to deal with, and they stopped answering my phone calls and emails. And in the meantime, I had located through genealogy a number of descendants of Edward Salter, the cooper who owned the governor's former plantation, and who likely had been the former cooper on the Queen Anne's Revenge. Well, they asked me if I could help them. They wanted to recover their ancestors' remains because, and by then, Edward Salter's bones, we determined, were in 3 cardboard boxes on a dusty shelf in a warehouse in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. and and so the descendants asked me if I could somehow help them see that maybe their ancestor could be respectfully reburied, because this Edward Salter, in fact, Edward Salter's last will and testament that actually bears his signature and his wax seal is in the collections of the North Carolina archives. I've handled it, the actual document, and in it it's his very first command to his wife and his family that he be respectfully buried on his property. So this began a legal effort. I, with the assistance of a very generous and very competent estate and probate attorney, we attempted to reopen Edward Salter's estate in court, county court, and that request or petition was denied. And I eventually was able to determine that that the state made no effort whatsoever to locate Edward Salter's next of kin upon removing or exhuming his remains from the grave, to allow them to participate in deciding what would happen to them. So we eventually won in a superior court the right for the descendants to reclaim their ancestors' remains so that they could be reburied. A few significant things about this Edward Salter, the Cooper. Again, Charles Johnson says Edward Salter was hanged in Williamsburg, but I could prove he lived another 20 years. He served 2 terms in the Colonial Assembly, and he also was a patron of the Church of England's parish there. It's called St. Thomas Parish. And Edward Salter and his fellow vestrymen decided they wanted to actually build a brick and mortar church. And so I've got a copy of it around here somewhere, but Edward Salter signed a letter that was sent to London indicating, and this was in 1734, that they had begun construction of their church, St. Thomas Church, which took about 20 years to build. Edward Salter died a couple of months after he signed that letter, very sadly and tragically, most likely from some type of illness. But the church still stands to this day and actually holds services every Sunday. It's really remarkable. So this is a church that was partially built with the money of a reformed pirate, former pirate. He didn't intend, Edward Salter did not, I don't think, ever intended to be a pirate. He was forced onto Blackbeard's crew off of Puerto Rico. But it's a pretty interesting story, and it's made even more interesting by the fact that Edward Salter had he had a daughter who participated in a tax protest around the time of the Boston Tea Party. He also had 3 grandsons who played heroic roles in the American Revolution. And he had a 4th grandson who was a 2-term governor of the state of Tennessee. And so this is a different kind of pirate story that I really enjoy sharing with the public. And the golden age of piracy wasn't entirely what Hollywood tries to make it out to be. These people were, had lives, and sometimes they accomplished great things, and their descendants accomplished great things. So back to Edward Salter's bones. How did they end up in my car? The family, or the descendants, wanted his bones to be examined a final time before we had them reburied, which his bones are now buried at St. Thomas Church, the church he helped to build. But we contacted the senior forensic anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution, who agreed to receive and spend some time examining the bones. He also concluded, although he didn't put this in writing, or he didn't write a report, that these bones were of a man who certainly had been a Cooper in his lifetime. They did some isotope tests on his bones and determined that he probably was born somewhere in the upper Chesapeake Bay. Then the day came. It came time to return Edward Salter to Bath, to Beaufort County. And so I was the one who drove to Washington to pick up the 3 boxes of bones and bring them back to the place where he once called home. We had them actually placed in a very authentically built period casket, a pine shouldered coffin, and then had his bones reburied. But it's an interesting addition to the Blackbeard story. And again, let me go back now. So I've done all this research, and in the process of the research, I began to develop a hunch as to the identity of the purported sister of Blackbeard, Susanna White. And sure enough, I was eventually able to find a document that proved my hunch, and that was that, in fact, Susanna White was not Blackbeard's sister. She was one of Edward Salter's granddaughters. So that was her connection to Blackbeard and the days of piracy in Bath. And there's absolutely no doubt about that at all. The records are very clear. So that brought me back full circle. I mean, so the book had already been published. So I published the first edition of the book in 2008, and the whole Edward Salter case occurred around 2010 to 2012 when we finally had him reburied. So I continue, that's the other thing about me that differentiates me from some of these other Blackbeard biographers, is that I not only have done the research and I've had done boots on the ground, or on the water, and but I've also, in some ways, become part of Blackbeard's history myself, unintentionally. I never set out to become part of his history, but I've organized symposiums. I actually started in 2008 the annual Blackbeard Memorial and Pirate Festival on Ocracoke Island that now happens every year, and will again this coming fall.
If I may interject just briefly, when exactly what is the date for the annual Blackbeard Festival?
It starts November 1st this year.
All right.
And in 2007, I began discussions with the leader of a pirate reenactment group known then as Blackbeard's Crew from the Virginia, Norfolk, Hampton area. And I convinced him to bring his entire group. There were 60 members to Ocracoke. And so on November 22nd of 2008, we held a very solemn memorial service on the sandy shore of where Blackbeard's final battle took place. And that's the most important part. I mean, it's now become sort of a pirate festival as well. Actually, in 2018, for the 300th anniversary, it was a 4-day event. Now we've reduced it to about a day and a half, but it's got all the same elements of most other pirate festivals, except I have to say that this is one that actually occurs where real pirate history took place. In fact, I would say that there are only 2 places that I know of in North Carolina, or even in the coast of America, well, Philadelphia. We know Blackbeard walked the streets of Philadelphia, but in North Carolina, he only was on the land at Bath and at Ocracoke. At Beaufort Inlet, they talk about how Blackbeard had a house in Beaufort, which the town of Beaufort didn't even exist. The house that they claim was Blackbeard's house wasn't built until 80 years after Blackbeard was killed. And this is the case just about everywhere. Everybody wants to have a piece of Blackbeard history and talk about how he used to frequent a tavern, for example, in Savannah that didn't exist in 1718. But at Ocracoke, I can say for a fact, I could even take you to there's a well in this forest where the pirates took on their fresh water, and it's still there. And I found it on maps in the early 18th century, actually a decade before Blackbeard was even there. So we're actually we do our best to recreate the Battle of Ocracoke using sailing vessels. They're not necessarily, they're not period authentic, but they are equipped with many cannon. In fact, really the premier vessel is a brig, a very authentic brig that's was built and is owned and sailed by a guy a good friend of mine, one of my best friends, who's who lives the life of a pirate and privateer, raised 4 children on his pirate ship, but his vessel, which is about 55 feet long, has, I think, 9 or more cannon aboard that are all operating. And so we sail around in the harbor, and we fire cannon, and it really thrills the public. And I'm pretty proud that all of this began because in 2007 I was there on November 22nd, the anniversary of the battle, and was there by myself and thought, wouldn't it be great to celebrate and honor this history, and then also to educate the public on the real story of piracy. And so we've sustained that all these years.
No, and I think that's a wonderful story, both the story about the Pirate Festival and also, of course, the story about Edward Salter. I think it's an excellent and wonderful story to sort of conclude on. And I also hope the reason I asked for the date is also hopefully the people watching the interview will be informed about it and maybe show up and get some attention to the festival.
And maybe you can attend some year too. We'd love that.
Oh yeah,
if you come, I'll put you on one of the pirate ships and have you firing cannon as well.
I'll try not to.
uh,
I'll try not to actually sink a ship.
Okay. I don't think you'll do that, but it's a real special place. It's a very unique little island, and really the story of the battle. So every year I do a major lecture or presentation, and so a couple years ago I decided to actually recreate the battle using period documents, step by step. How Maynard arrived. Maynard came from the inland waters of North Carolina. He didn't arrive from the ocean, which completely changes the narrative. I mean, if you ever want to do another podcast, we could spend an entire podcast talking about how different the actual battle was from the way it's been told in many books. But yes, I love going out to Ocracoke and just seeing what. So there's some parts of it that haven't changed at all from the time Blackbeard was there. I mean, it would look very familiar to him.
To sort of round off the video and wind down a bit, I have a few
Sure.
sort of fun, quick questions to finish off.
Okay.
And this, I think this sort of relates to the Pirate Festival as well. Have you ever tried any period pirate recipes?
Well, I have actually. In originally in the Blackbeard's crew, every year they would have a period dinner, and they invited me to participate in that. And I found it really hard to eat the meat they were cooking with a wooden fork and spoon, which I guess is what they use. But yes, I have. I can't say anything in particular, except I will say, just for fun, that today a lot of pirate festivals, and there are a number of them that occur in North Carolina, where on the last day of the festival they have this event called Pirates and Pancakes. I guess they do this because of the alliteration, of the words pirates and pancakes. I never thought of pancakes as being pirate food, but a lot of young people today, when they go to these festivals, I guess maybe they leave thinking that pirates ate pancakes. So I love pancakes, so I'm just going to go with it and say that's my favorite pirate food.
And also we talked a bit about the recreations of the engagements. Which pirate ship type would you say is your favorite?
Well, I could answer that a lot of different ways. I think maybe my favorite pirate ship might be my friend's pirate ship, the Mika II. His name is Horatio Sinbad. People can Google him and find him pretty easily. And I mean, he's lived a fascinating life. And again, he raised 4 kids on his pirate ship. And I encourage people to look into that. That might be my favorite pirate ship.
And the final question, and I've kind of made it into a double question. Blackbeard is really recognized for this flag, with the skeleton with the horns stabbing a heart. What are your thoughts on this flag, this famous flag, and also what would you say is your own favorite pirate flag?
I might say that that's my most favorite pirate flag, even though it's entirely fake, at least in terms or in relation to Blackbeard. The few records that we have that describe a flag being used during any sort of pirating engagement involving Blackbeard simply said that they were either black flags or death's head, simply a death's head. I've researched this extensively and written an article that's actually available online, um, that goes very deeply into the origins of these different flags and who they were attributed to. And it actually was a German publication from the 1950s that first related or associated the skeleton with the spear and the bleeding heart, um, and the drops of blood to Blackbeard. The German author's name escapes me at the time, but I was amused that Blackbeard's name in German was Schwarzbart, I believe, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and which is essentially Blackbeard. But then it didn't again show up in any sort of publication until 1978, when this English adventurer and author named Douglas Bottling attributed that flag to Blackbeard. Um, it amuses me to see it flying everywhere. Um, I actually live in the western part of the state of North Carolina, high up in the mountains, and I've even seen Blackbeard's flag flying up here, that particular flag. In 2018, in celebration of the 300th anniversary of the wrecking of the Queen Anne's Revenge and Blackbeard's last days, the state of North Carolina flew the skeleton and the bleeding heart and spear on all of their ferries. That was one of the flags that were flown on the ferries, even though, again, it's entirely fake. It had nothing to do with Blackbeard. If Blackbeard had seen that flag, I've joked that maybe he would have thought it was a little over the top, that they spent a little too much time working on that. Too many little elements. They didn't need that flag. All they needed was simply a black flag. I'll stick with the fake Blackbeard flag as being my favorite, because it's given me the opportunity to research and write about it and publish articles. So that's a good thing.
I mean, whatever gives us a reason to talk about or research, it's a good a reason as any. And well, I think that's a really excellent sort of end note to end the interview on. I don't have any more questions, so thank you so much. It was wonderful, I think.
Well, and I thank you for this opportunity. And I have to say that I agreed to do this because I see that you are highly respected, really, especially in the pirate reenactment community, and people who are interested in pirate history, and all the work you've done in the the videos and the podcast. I definitely salute you and encourage you to keep at it.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the interview with Kevin Duffus. I hope you found it as insightful as I did, especially since I've previously given the limelight to Baylus's theories on Blackbeard. I figured it just to give some alternatives the spotlight as well. I'm curious to hear in the comments what you think of Mr. Duffus's theories, and whether you align with his or Baylus's, or maybe even the original story told by Captain Charles Johnson in A General History. If you want to check out Mr. Duffus's work, you'll find his Facebook page in the video description and pinned comment below. If you want to contact him, you can toss an email over to blackbeard@thelostlight.com. Finally, the annual Ocracoke Blackbeard Pirate Jamboree, that's a mouthful, will be held this year on the 1st and 2nd of November. You'll find a link to the Facebook event page in, you guessed it, the video description and pinned comment below. Get out there and support the crew. This is only the first episode in the new season of the Piratical podcast. New interviews are coming up soon, and if there's any guests you would like me to invite over and talk to, you know what to tell me. I'll be seeing you soon.